Welcome back to the Long COVID and CFS Holistic Healing Summit. I'm Laurie Rivers, and we're here with Dr. Todd Davenport. He is a tenured full professor of physical therapy and director of the Doctor of Physical Therapy program at the University of the Pacific in California. Dr. Davenport, Todd, is interested in best practices for myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and long COVID as well, and has authored articles describing clinical reasoning processes for the symptom-based diagnosis of pathology by physical therapists. Now, all of this is a mouthful, but we're going to be talking about this, and he's going to explain some of that. And this is in order to be able to determine the appropriateness of physical therapy and guide intervention, which can be tricky, right? Which we know that because physical exertion is tricky. So he's the recipient of several distinguished service teaching and research publication awards and serves as the scientific advisor to the excellent WorkWell Foundation. So welcome, Todd. Thank you so much for being here with us.
I so appreciate the chance to be with you and to speak with everyone. Thank you.
Yes. Now, Todd's going to be speaking with us about heart rate monitoring in order to avoid or reduce post-exertional malaise. And really, before we start talking about heart rate monitoring and post-exertional malaise, I always like to know where you're coming from. So your origin story, what got you interested in ME/CFS and now long COVID and this approach in the first place?
Great question. I don't really have the opportunity to tell this story too often. So thanks for the chance to do it. Thanks for being interested in it. So I was in college and I was a two-sport athlete in college, and swimming and track, and really enjoyed both of them, but noticed that fatigue is a huge issue when you're exerting your body, training and so forth. And so I got really interested as an exercise science major and a psychology double major in this idea of fatigue. Like, what is it? What causes it? How does it work? And so I remember I did a bachelor's of science thesis project, where I basically invited all my swimmer friends to come pedal as much as they could on the bike until they got tired. And of course, everyone's really fit, so it's impossible to get people tired with the exercise task. But finally folks registered that they were tired, and I had them go play a simple video game to measure their reaction time. So I got really interested in like this whole idea of like, how does fatigue affect your brain? This is back like 1998, so. And I sort of carried this thread of being interested in working with people who have fatigue, with me into physical therapy school. So I did an experience out the United States National Institutes of Health, working with people who have inflammatory muscle diseases. So trying to validate different ways to measure physical performance in folks who have muscle disease in the context of a big clinical trial that they were running. So I did that again, fatigue, right? And then as a new faculty member here at Pacific, I was just kind of browsing the website, and I noticed this thing called the Pacific Fatigue Lab. And I thought, wow, I should just go over there and say hi. So I popped in the lab one day and I said, hi, my name's Todd. I'm a new faculty member here. I've done some work with tired people to try and understand this. What do you do here? And that really was the genesis of sort of the last 12 or 13 years of just really cool research work, clinical practice work in folks with post-exertional malaise or post-exertional symptom exacerbations, such as with ME/CFS and long COVID, and doing some science translation work, helping to translate the physiology to patients and patient groups, and also to physical therapists and other rehab providers. So it's been fun. It's been a fun, gratifying way to contribute, recognizing the gravity of what we're researching and how we research it. It's hopefully getting the information into the hands of the people who will use it. And so that's why I value opportunities like this. So thank you.
Yeah. I love that. I love that story. So we're going to be focusing mostly on heart rate monitoring. We'll also go into some of the other things that you can do too. alleviate or make that PEM, post-exertional malaise, less likely to happen or less intense. Let's talk a little bit more about PEM, about post-exertional malaise that comes along with long COVID and ME/CFS that's so frustrating.
Yeah, so post-exertional malaise is, of course, unmistakable to the person who's living with it, but to describe it briefly, it's profound fatigue. Fatigue doesn't do the symptom
Yeah,
justice.
I
It's
call
like
it
being,
bone. What do I call it? It's like bone tired.
yeah, bone
It's
tired.
yeah.
I have heard bonked. There's just nothing left in the tank, if we're gonna make up a word that would suffice here. I've
Right.
talked with marathon runners who ran marathons before they had ME/CFS and before they had long COVID, and I asked them to compare the fatigue of a marathon to the fatigue of post-exertional malaise or post-exertional symptom exacerbation, and they say it doesn't compare. The PEM
Wow.
fatigue is so much more profound than even running a marathon. Um,
Heard that before, and that is very helpful in
it's really instructive, isn't
practice.
it?
Yeah, yeah,
It just gives you a sense of just the depth of functional disablement and the inability to participate in simple things that many people take for granted.
yeah.
Post-exertional malaise is neurological, immunological, and metabolic. It's
Right.
all of them, and you can't tease them apart. Some people tend to have kind of maybe a little bit more over here, and some people maybe have a little bit more over here, but it's, you never really tease them fully apart. All kind of components are present just in everybody. It's not just the fatigue. It can be cognitive dysfunction. Sometimes we hear it called brain fog. Hard to attend to things, hard to remember things. So short-term attention and memory tend to be affected. Also, shortness of breath, chest pain and tightness, cough, especially in folks with long COVID.
Right.
This feeling of breathlessness that is not associated with a decrease in oxygen in your blood. So people are not desaturating, but they're out of breath anyway, which is notable because normally your breath is tied in with your carbon dioxide levels, basically, and
Right.
oxygen levels indirectly, and that process becomes decoupled in post-exertional malaise. And numbness and tingling and weakness and sore throats and swollen glands, all of these are associated with activity or with exercise, which is the post-exertional part. So taken together, all of these symptoms and signs really suggest an abnormal response, recovery response to activity. And that activity, in our lab, of course, at the Workwell Foundation, we use cardiopulmonary exercise testing, which is a very standardized, very clinical, procedure. But it may be something like chopping vegetables or dropping your kid off at school or
Yeah.
trying to take a walk with friends. Those things can trigger a crash. It does not have to be maximal exertion. So the key points are symptoms that are horribly disabling, severely disabling, totally unusual as it relates to how we normally expect people to adapt to an activity or recover from an activity. And in response to activities that you just wouldn't expect that level or that scale of response.
Right. Which brings into, when I'm working with students and clients, we go into pacing so much because then that if you did something out of the ordinary that's not within your usual pacing, within your usual energy envelopes,
Mm-hmm.
then you can pinpoint it more easily. And
Well,
I
and I'm sorry to interrupt. I think you sort of suggested something that was really important. It's really hard to do this from a brochure or from a handout. You need to have a person that can
right,
help you kind of sort through this. And so this is a collaborative activity. And I just want to sort of point that out to the listeners that, this is a type of a condition that really relies on a strong, trusting therapeutic relationship, because you're going to be plumbing, people's activities and their lives and their values and what they want to do And so there needs to be that foundation of that trusting therapeutic relationship.
That's such a great point. And of course, we know that it can be very difficult to find someone who knows these illnesses and who's willing to put in that time and effort. So let's talk about that specifically as far as how you approach the heart rate monitoring with people with long COVID and ME/CFS.
Yeah, so to talk about heart rate monitoring, we sort of have to talk a little bit about the physiology of post-exertional malaise or
Great.
post-exertional symptom exacerbations. I don't want to get too technical, but I would like to start with an analogy that I like to use with patients. And that analogy is that your body, believe it or not, the way it uses energy is a lot like a plug-in hybrid car. So it has two different sources of energy. The plug-in hybrid car has the battery, which is used, for getting around town, flat surfaces, not really hauling anything, city speed, so forth. And then you have the gas motor, which is good for going up and down hills. If you have to haul something, if you have to go freeway speeds, the gas motor kicks in to help spin the wheels a little bit. And the gas motor can charge the battery, which is cool because then you don't have to plug in the battery as long.
Right.
And so your body is really similar in that regard. It has a short-term energy system. You use it, it's gone. It's in the muscles, you use it, it's gone. And then it has a long-term energy system, which is kind of like that gas motor, which uses oxygen to kind of break apart glucose, sugar, and takes a couple minutes for it to kick in. But once it kicks in, it's really powerful until kind of right at the end at maximal exertion when it doesn't work very well anymore. And then other processes take over that really don't use oxygen in order to metabolize what we call lactic acid. So really ME/CFS, long COVID, conditions characterized by post-exertional malaise are a little bit like that gas motor not working, that aerobic energy system not working. So if you think about, we go back to our analogy of the plug-in hybrid car, if the gas motor doesn't work, you lost your ability to do things for long periods of time at high speeds and hauling, towing. And you've also lost the ability to charge the battery. So what you'll do is you'll run on the battery until you can't run on the battery anymore. And then you're stuck at the side of the road, which would be like a crash. So the idea would be to find kind of the cut point where the car knows to switch from the battery to the gas, so that we don't rely on that unreliable gas motor anymore, but we run off the battery as judiciously as we can. So that's really kind of pacing in a nutshell, kind of biometrically considered pacing. And so, in the body, of course, there's a level of exertion where, your short-term energy storage, kind of tends to go away. And then your short-term energy system tends to predominate and then go away. And then you have the long-term energy system, which comes on after a certain duration or a certain intensity of exercise. And we can use heart rate to kind of figure out that transition. And so really, if we can determine the heart rate where you start to transition between your short-term energy storage or processes, I should say, and your long-term energy processes, then we can kind of figure out how to stay away from that unreliable or that broken long-term energy system. And that's really kind of the foundation of heart rate monitoring in a nutshell.
I like that. I have not heard that analogy, metaphor, whatever it is.
Now, if you ask me more about how a hybrid car works, I can't answer, but that's
Right.
the depth of my knowledge about how these cars work. But it just always struck me that, the body and the hybrid car, in terms of their energy systems that make them go are pretty similar.
Right. Gotcha. So somebody with long COVID or with ME/CFS or any other, post-exertional malaise illness comes to you and says, help, let's do some heart rate monitoring. How do you start with that?
Yeah, so the first thing we do, of course, after we talk a lot about triggering activities and we talk a lot about symptoms, what the chief symptoms are, what the most disabling ones are, what some of the secondary symptoms are, so that we can track them over time and really get to know the person's life, their lifestyle, the things they did, the aspirations to do. Then we start talking about heart rate monitoring. So the heart rate monitoring really is, we find a monitor that will work for the patient. And my philosophy is, I kind of have a split idea about this. My first idea is sort of, as someone who's scientifically inclined, is to say we need the best heart rate monitor to get the most accurate measurements. And so that would lead us to monitors that are sensors that are mounted on chest straps. And let me just tell you that almost everyone hates chest straps. And so the clinician in me says, well, what good is a reliable measurement if no one will wear your monitor? That's where I've learned to kind of like, okay, be okay with a lot of things. There are some brands that are more reliable than others, but for the most part, we've had good luck with HAULER and with Garmin, and we're playing more with Whoop straps. It's a little bit different, type of a setup that they have, but those are generally good. The heart rate monitors that tend to work real well are the ones that will give you some kind of an alert, a chime. The watch face will light up, and you have to have a training zone that's low enough to accommodate your heart rate numbers, and that can be tricky. So you really have to kind of read the technical inserts that nobody really wants to read in order to make sure that the watch that you're getting has that capability.
Yes. And I think what I would love to do, I'm going to write this down, is to see if I can get a list from you of the ones that y'all use, recommend, whatever, that do have those functions. Because I know that I tried to do that and it was,
well, so it's hard. So there aren't many, and part of the reason that there aren't many is that these watches are geared toward fitness.
Right.
And so they assume a certain heart rate level for cardiorespiratory training. And so there's a certain amount of ableism that's built into these platforms.
Sure.
There's a product coming on the market that's from a company called Visible. They are working towards coming up with a hardware and an app that specifically is for heart rate based pacing, heart rate biofeedback. So watch out for that. That's going to be exciting when it comes out. Right now, they're doing some beta testing, and so hopefully, fingers crossed soon. But yeah, it's a tough sled to try and find a monitor currently that will do that. And again, because of just kind of the baked in ableism of the monitors and the apps.
Right. So, okay, so we've started talking to the patient about, you've started talking to them about heart rate monitoring and the device specifically. How do you determine, well, I'm going to ask two questions here.
Mm-hmm.
How do you specifically determine the max heart rate? And then we'll get into how people can do that on their own, even though it's not going to be as accurate.
So the preferred way would be to take the heart rate at what we call ventilatory anaerobic threshold, which is basically the point at which your body kind of starts to go into oxygen debt on an exercise test. And we would do that on the second day of a 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise test.
Okay, let's go into that, because that's so important. When people are telling me that they're going to have a treadmill test, the name that you said,
and
it's only one day, I'm like, well, you're causing yourself to have a crash for no reason whatsoever.
Well, the whole rationale behind a 2-day CPET instead of just one is the first cardiopulmonary exercise test. We can get some useful information from that.
Okay.
But we're doing basically a standardized physical stressor that's intended to induce post-exertional malaise.
Right.
And that the second test is kind of where the magic happens, which is that now you're measuring the physiology in the post-exertional state.
Yeah.
So having one is very limited in terms of its utility. If you're gonna have one, you better have two. because if you're going to push yourself into a crash in order to get good information, you might as well get the best information you can.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, for people who are severely involved, one may be all you need. And so there was a method paper that we put out, the Workwell Foundation group put out in 2018 that talks about a lot of the clinical considerations, the research considerations about the test and how the test works and so forth. So it's all written down someplace. But yeah, there's always a balance, because we don't want to push people unnecessarily into a crash,
Right.
who are already moderately to severely impaired. So I'm sort of conceding the point here ahead of time that we're really working with people with kind of mild to moderate impairment, people who can get to a test center, people who can do a 2-day CPET. Not everybody can do that.
Right.
So one test might be relevant. And then there's also the alternative of calculating your heart rate thresholds if there's a concern for a crash after this test and recovery after a crash, or if you can't get to a test because they're not super common to be able to get to. So there are ways you can grab your favorite calculator and put yourself in the ballpark.
Right. And how do we do that?
So you take your age predicted maximum heart rate, and I certainly can send you this equation for people to use. So that way I don't talk about it too much here, because talking about an equation is always really awkward. But you take your age predicted kind of theoretical maximum, and then you take about 55% of that number. 55% of that number is, so it's 60% of that number is on average where people start to go into oxygen debt on an exercise test. And so we add a 5% safety margin. Now, there was a paper that came out that tried to correlate that 55% number with the ventilatory anaerobic threshold value, and found out that it didn't correlate very well at all. In fact, the 55% number tended to undershoot that oxygen debt point, which is actually great.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't want to go over. We don't want people to
Right.
make all this sacrifice to pace, only to pace based off of a bad number. So it turned out to be really good news. So that's the first way. And then the second way to do this is to take your resting heart rate, which is if you have a heart rate monitor, this would be the heart rate a few minutes before you wake up. So you'll have to wear your heart rate monitor to bed in order to get this measurement. And then you add 15 beats to your resting value. So you'll have two numbers. The rest plus 15 tends to be lower. The 55% of max tends to be higher, and sometimes demonstrably so. So what this does is it sets up a range.
Nice.
And I think of this, Lori, as paying off a credit card. Most of us have been in a position where we've had to pay off some kind of a debt at some point. And so you can pay as you go, which will keep the company off your case. And then maybe you have a good month and you can make double payments. So part of it can go to principal. And so I think about that max, 55% of max as being pay as you go. This is a threshold that you really shouldn't go over. If you do, then the credit card company is coming after you.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that by analogy. And I think of rest plus 15 as being double payments. If you can stay under that, then you're really going to make good headway towards either maintaining, or if you're in a crash, really like getting yourself to a better functional baseline.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Holistic Healing with Lori podcast. And I do hope that you found our conversation enlightening and helpful. That is always my goal. If you did, I have a small favor to ask. Please do consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. That would really, really help us, not only to improve, but also to help others to discover the podcast. And especially if you know someone who is navigating their way through ME/CFS, through long COVID, fibromyalgia, or any chronic illness, please also share this podcast with them. My mission is to reach as many people as possible, to instill this feeling of hope and help, and to share the insights and strategies that I know really work to help them on their healing journey. And just remember that you're not alone in this. we're in this all together, learning and growing and healing. And I'll see you next time.